Welcome, everyone. Welcome back to the Next Big Thing podcast. My name is Chris Gennady, Global Head of Research at Wisdom Tree, and Mobeen, a director within our research team. Mobeen and I are back together. Mobeen Tahir, you've seen him before many times with us on this podcast. We are extremely excited today because we are joined by Oliver Walker Jones, Head of Marketing, Communications, and Brand at Joby Aviation. And we are going to be discussing all things electric, vertical takeoff and landing, eVTOL. You might have seen that acronym before. That is what we are here to discuss. But before we do that, I need to say the following to clarify: the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of Wisdom Tree and Joby Aviation and are subject to change. Anything we present in this podcast is not intended to be relied on as a forecast, research, nor as investment or tax advice. The information and opinions expressed in this podcast are not a recommendation, offer, or solicitation to buy or sell any securities, and reliance upon them is at the sole discretion of the listener. Please remember, past performance is no indication of future results. Excellent. And with that, I would love to hear from you, Oliver, essentially a bit about, because obviously a lot of us might dream as kids, like with playing with the Matchbox toys and the Legos, like to actually work on a vehicle, much less a vehicle that flies, and you're basically inventing it from the ground up. But for most of us, that is a fantasy, but for you it is a reality. So how is it that you end up actually working on a new class of flying vehicle?
So thanks for having me. I would say it is definitely a little bit of every little boy, every little girl's dream, right? To get to go to work every day and work on airplanes and things that fly and zoom through the sky, and it is super exciting. The development of eVTOLs, or kind of air taxis, as we typically refer to them, is something that's been a long time in the making, right? You kind of go back to the '60s, the '70s, the '80s. There are cultural indications that we all wanted this to happen, from the Jetsons to the Fifth Element. We knew that we wanted to move through the sky, but what didn't exist back then was the technology to make it happen. And so what's happened across the last few decades, things like battery density, computing power, and lightweight materials have all come along that have basically enabled this technology to literally and metaphorically take off. And so Joby, particularly for the last 15 years, has been working on developing the technology to make that happen. And we're kind of at the point now where it's starting to feel like a reality. So, I've been working in the sector for 6, 7 years now, and the way that I've always judged it is, the first days that I went to work, we just had a render of an aircraft. That was back when I was at Rolls Royce, and then I went to work at another company in Germany called Lilium, and eventually after a while we had one aircraft. And then when I moved to Joby 3 years ago now, we're like, oh, there's two aircraft, and then there's three aircraft, and now we have three on our production line. And so it's beginning to feel very real. Now, you can go every day to work, you can see aircraft fly. We have one down at Edwards Air Force Base with the US Department of Defense. We have one flying up at Marina at our base in California. And so, it's beginning to feel like this technology is really very real.
Now, something that is referenced, and the nice thing about Joby, even if they're not sort of passenger ready, meaning that there's not yet a location where somebody like me, not working at the company, can directly, fly in the vehicle. But there are so many videos and sort of multimedia experiences that you can take in on the internet. And one of the things that people widely reference is actually it feels like they're expecting it to be a noisier experience because maybe they're used to the helicopter and maybe the fact that the blades are spinning past the speed of sound or something and creating that, thump, thump, thump. And we all hear it, the helicopter is way up in the air and it feels like it's across the street or something, extremely loud, but yet people on these videos discuss how quiet this particular thing is. What was the journey in terms of thinking about the sound profile and designing the engines in such a way that you're actually able, because I know being quiet is sort of important in getting approved for takeoff and landing in
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of different locations at the end of the day.
Yeah, so moving back to basics for a second, the aircraft that we're talking about has six propellers on it instead of one like a helicopter has, but it's roughly the same size. We're talking about something that carries a pilot and four passengers. So yeah, when people look at it, they see helicopter, but actually, this thing takes off and lands vertically like a helicopter, but then also has a wing which allows it to fly forwards in horizontal flight, much more like a conventional aircraft. And so it's sort of a hybrid of a conventional aircraft and a helicopter. But the really important bit is that it's electric, right? And that allows you to do a lot of different things, including distribute the power across the aircraft. So we call it distributed electric propulsion, or DEP. Basically, instead of one large rotor in the middle that has to pull the power of the whole helicopter into the air, we divide that by six. And each of those propellers that we have around the body of the aircraft lift. Now, the great thing is when you divide that up into six, not only do you get redundancy, so you get increased safety. In other words, if one of them stops working, hey, look, there are still five more. But actually, you put much less pressure on each of them, which allows you to make the acoustic profile of the aircraft much lower. So it's a considerably quieter aircraft. So partly it's because you divided it up. Partly it's because it doesn't have an engine, right? It has six electric motors, each of them dual wound, so actually technically 12, but we use six at any one point. And those don't have combustion happening within them. They don't have hundreds or thousands of moving parts. They just have one moving part. Much like a electric car today is considerably quieter than a gas-powered car, the same works with an aircraft like ours. And then finally, because we have that wing that I described, when you're flying forwards in kind of conventional flight, most of the lift that's holding the aircraft in the air is being generated by the wing and not by the rotor, and therefore you're getting basically much quieter lift for the aircraft. So for all those reasons, you end up with an aircraft that is way, way, way quieter than a helicopter, surprisingly so for anybody that comes and visits it. And what we hope that does is allows us to access cities, towns, and locations that are much closer to where you want to go. If you think about helicopters today, why don't we use them? We don't really, well, I don't use them anyway. I don't know about you guys, but people typically don't use helicopters because they're expensive and because they're just not there, and they're not there because they're expensive, they're noisy, and they're not necessarily as safe as people would want them to be. And so we can solve the safety by adding redundancy, and we can solve the noise profile by using electric. And therefore, we hope that we'll be able to get you, say, to downtown Manhattan and be able to operate tens, if not more, operations out of there per hour, which means that we can bring the price of the aircraft down, the price of the tickets down, and we can get people flying much, much more regularly than you do on a helicopter today.
Oliver, it's nice that you mentioned the safety and the noise profile. When seeing investors in Europe, I have on a few occasions introduced them to Joby's eVTOL and asked them if they'd be up for a ride. Now, some people say for sure. Others are just amazed and perhaps need a bit more time to digest this exciting new technology. And that's because it seems like it's such an unfamiliar mode of transportation for most people to just imagine what it might be like to take a ride in something like this. It's not part of our DNA as it is to go in a car or a plane or maybe for some people on a boat. What's your view on how the masses will react to this technology when it's made publicly available?
So I think that's one of the most important questions that we have as an industry. And I would say a couple of things in response. The first is, yeah, it will feel different. I think hardly anybody gets to experience vertical lift on a regular basis today. And it's going to be a pretty different experience for people. I kind of hope actually it's going to be relatively magical because the views you'll get of the city beneath you and the idea of being able to kind of fly over a city feels futuristic, and will get most people to at least try it. And I think it's the same with the adoption of any kind of technology, right? The speed at which people try it or don't try it depends on their own risk appetite and their own attitude to technology. I actually just this last weekend took my first ride in a Waymo autonomous taxi in San Francisco, and for me that was one of those like, well, I'm definitely not the first person. When I posted about it on LinkedIn, I'm like, this doesn't actually feel novel anymore because I think lots of people did it years ago. But, that's a great example. Then when I told my mum, she was like, was it terrifying? I would never do that. Did you put the kids in it? And I think, everybody has a different profile, right, of what they're going to be willing to accept. certainly in the early days of service, I think we're going to be supply constrained rather than demand constrained in any case. It's going to be as many aircraft as we can get out of a factory and onto a line. And I don't think, I think there will be enough people to prove that it's perfectly normal and great that the adoption won't be a particular problem for us. And then the final thing to say on that, of course, is, if it comes down to safety, well, it's certified by what is, I'm relatively confident, the most rigorous bodies that there are out there in terms of safety. So in the US, that's the Federal Aviation Administration. There's a reason that traveling by air is the safest form of travel, and that partly is the physics, but more than anything, it's the rigor with which the agencies apply the safety standards. The certification program for an aircraft like this is years and years and years long, involves thousands and thousands and thousands of tests and thousands of people to do it. And so, people should have the confidence that when we get to the end of that certification process, it should be a safe aircraft to get on.
It's cool you mentioned the Waymo example and your personal experience, because a big news relating to Joby Aviation recently was the company's acquisition of X-Wing's autonomy division. And we know that with automobiles, the journey to fully autonomous driving has not been an easy one. Some people even make jokes about Elon Musk and his promises about how soon we might see fully autonomous cars uh, on our roads across the board. Uh, will the journey to autonomous eVTOLs, now we're talking about a new technology to begin with, and then we're adding another layer altogether of fully autonomous eVTOLs. Tell us about what that journey might look like and how might that compare to the journey for autonomous transportation as it is unfolding in automobiles.
So, to be really clear, we plan to start commercial service with a commercially qualified pilot on board. Like, there's no question. We plan to have a pilot at the front of the aircraft, and we haven't put a date on when full autonomy. When you take that pilot out and fly the aircraft with no pilot, that we haven't put a date on that. We don't think it's in the kind of near or accessible term. We think it's a future technology, but that said, we do think it's a really important technology, partly because it allows us to improve the economics of the aircraft. If you can use the fifth seat as a pilot, but also because if you have a very, very rational conversation about the safety of aircraft, it's fair to say that a significant number of incidents, accidents, issues with aircraft are things that are induced by humans in the loop, right? And if you take that out, actually, you potentially have the opportunity for a safer aircraft. That said, even if you never got to the point where you took the pilot fully out of the aircraft, all of those automation autonomy tools allow you to assist a pilot that's in an aircraft. So you can take away some of the tasks that they have to do and let them focus on flying the aircraft itself, right? So even if you're not full autonomy, you're still assisting them. It's a little bit like some of the driving aids that you get in cars today, right? That kind of keep you in the lane or bleep when you're about to pull into somebody else's lane. But if you look at the path to autonomy, the great thing about the air is there are many, many fewer things to bump into, to put it bluntly, in the sky than there are on a street. A street is a very complex thing for a vision set to understand, whereas the air is a little more, well, I wouldn't say it's more organized, but there's just nothing there. And so we see the path as relatively clear. The company that we acquired, X-Wing, have already flown hundreds of missions with a fully autonomous aircraft, nobody on board, point to point or same airport to same airport, up in the air using a Cessna Caravan. It's a relatively small light aircraft that you can fly around. And, they're already doing it. They have contracts with the Department of Defense to develop that technology. It's probably a dual-use technology at the end of the day. We see a very clear path to getting it to commercialization, but we haven't put a date on it yet.
Now, Oliver, something that we're hearing a lot about these days, because when NVIDIA does a presentation and Jensen Huang does a presentation, be it in Taiwan, be it in California, wherever he is, it becomes almost like a rock star scenario. And the big thing that I personally pay attention to, I mean, everyone's paying attention to the chips, but they're talking about all these sort of things that you could envision would be tools that can be used for the quote unquote factory of the future. It can allow the factory, be it with these things like digital twins and the omniverse and all this stuff that seems to be aimed at you take a factory and you're either squeezing out all the various efficiencies, doing things in new ways, benefiting from new types of materials and composites. When you're because you mentioned, it's been a 15-year journey to even get to where we are today, and sort of the thing to always remember is every single aspect here is being done and designed by Joby. So you're literally building and creating a new vehicle that didn't exist before, building and creating the engines, building and creating everything. So are there sort of overlaps and intersects with, say, other mega trends and technologies like AI that might be influencing the current, say, factory floor with that Joby Aviation?
Yeah, so I think that's a really fascinating question. So we are partnered with Toyota, by the way. So we have certainly the world's largest car auto manufacturer to support us in designing our manufacturing facilities, making sure that we're as efficient as possible, and maximizing the technology that's existed until today. And that's a relationship that will continue to go from here. Obviously, they're our largest external investor, key strategic partner, and we have dozens of employees from Toyota working with us on the factory floor every day. So we're kind of already, hopefully, at the cutting edge of what manufacturing should look like. But as we look ahead to something like AI, for sure, we see opportunities with it. I think we're kind of at the beginning of the curve of working out what those might be. One really good example, actually, I'll take it away from manufacturing for a second, would be something like predictive maintenance. So, if you're flying an aircraft, one of the things that is really painful today for, say, helicopters particularly is, hey, a part fails and you weren't expecting it, or it happened before your scheduled maintenance time, and you have to have the aircraft on the ground for days, if not weeks, to kind of go in and fix something. It's like, what if not only is our motor simpler, but like, what if we're able to start predicting when those parts will need replacing before they actually need replacing, and doing it on a dynamic basis. So if you're getting a huge data pull from an aircraft that looks at all of the parameters of how it's performing and all the parts and how they're reporting, and you're able to stream that data, pool it, and assess it, you can look at individual aircraft and decide where parts might need to be replaced sooner than expected. Or, you're also informing back to your manufacturing line, hey, look, we've got a fleet of 100 aircraft in city A, and what we're seeing is in the weather conditions in that city, is that the part B is degrading sooner than expected. How about you tweak the design by 5 degrees to change something that might allow it to last long? It's those kind of like paths of education that use large amounts of data to help us predict something like keep the aircraft in the air a little bit more. That's an area where we think we might well see an early adoption of AI. One of the challenges we will have is that there's no certification basis. Back to the point that everything is super highly regulated in aviation. You can't just kind of throw new tools in and without somebody looking very, very carefully at it. So AI has a role to play. It's a more regulated industry than others. I would also say that there are also ancillary benefits to a company like ours, where if we're running to the point of vertical integration, not only are we designing all the parts and building all the parts of the aircraft, but we're actually intending to run the service in a lot of places too. So you'll be getting on a Joby aircraft built by Joby, but you'll be experiencing a Joby service. And in that case, there's great language tools that are going to allow us to do things like customer service as well using AI. We expect in the future.
I was taking a flight earlier this week, and I know all of us, listeners included, have had this experience where you're lining up, getting ready to board, and suddenly they say, "Oh, you see that plane out there? Yeah, yeah, we can't use that plane because it's going to our maintenance facility." So I guess the baseline is also not quite using those predictive things, not quite yet. So keeping those planes in the air, and keeping the passengers getting the level of it's one of the most important things. We say such and such time you're going to be at boarding, you're going to be doing this.
Hmm.
That's the key. I mean, if you're at least close to that, you can't be too upset about anything else. Now, something else I was thinking, Oliver, because you look at the plane out the window, or you look out the window of the plane and you see the wing, and the word
Yeah.
light is certainly not something that comes to mind. It looks like almost a hunk of solid steel with the various things that move up and down as you watch. But uh, obviously if we're sitting here saying, okay, we have to optimize, we have to power this thing by electricity, it's not jet fuel, and probably the electricity is not as
Hmm.
energy dense as jet fuel. I mean, few things are, and it's a whole sort of different setup. But when you're sort of going through that process to ultimately determine what are the best or most appropriate materials and how should you configure them to sort of build, let's think of the wing as an example, in a way where it's big enough to provide the appropriate lift, has the right surface area, but at the same time the weight in a way is sort of more optimized, as opposed to, again, what you see outside of the giant 737 or 777, whatever you're flying on, where it looks like it's literally tons and tons and tons, and you're sitting there thinking, I know the physics work, but my God, this thing must be heavy.
Yeah. So the great thing about carbon composite is that it's right strength and lightweight material, and it's been used in aerospace for quite a long time. We're not the first people to try and build something out of carbon composite. The Dreamliner, for example, utilizes that material already. But with the first industry, I would say, it's not just Joby, but the first industry to try and build broadly entire aircraft out of a carbon composite, so including the fuselage, the wing, tail. Um, it's a great material to use, right? Super strong, super lightweight, and flexible, and allows us to deliver what we want from an aircraft. But that's kind of where we started. We didn't. We started with the very first principle of like, what is the right aircraft to service this market, which is the one that will deliver a business case that makes sense. So if you go and survey the nascent eVTOL or air taxi industry, you'll see aircraft that look completely different. There's one seaters, two seaters, five seaters, six seaters, seven seaters. I probably missed three in there somewhere. And you see ones with multi-rotors and ones with wings and ones with propellers that tilt and ones with propellers that stow, ones with like two wings and ones with one wing. There's a little bit of everything. And that, eventually over time, I expect those designs will start to coalesce around a couple of good ideas. But we started from the premise of like, what will make business sense? And so we knew that you needed to have 5 seats to make a business case. So, you're kind of paying for that pilot with the 4 passengers behind them. We also knew that you needed range that was meaningful. So the aircraft we designed has a maximum range of 100 miles. We actually expect the majority of trips to be around kind of the 20-mile mark to begin with in urban areas, but we have a maximum range of 100. And we think that's important because if you can't go to the destination, what's the point of the aircraft? And it needs a speed that allows you to get where you're going, at a speed that makes a difference compared to sitting in an Uber or whatever on the ground. And so the aircraft's very much designed around those parameters. In order to do that, you need a wing, you need vertical lift, and you need a very lightweight aircraft. And so the aircraft basically pulls takeoff twice the power of a Tesla, but it has a curb weight that's lower than one of the bigger Teslas that would sit on the road next to you. And so it's super, super lightweight. It still includes all the redundancy. So, we've got like a triple redundant flight control computer, and each of those motors, I said, kind of actually contains 2 motors. We've got 4 battery packs spread around the aircraft. So we've had to do a lot. What that really means is, you shouldn't expect on the aircraft to have, a drinks trolley and lots of entertainment equipment and, luxurious pillows and things because, the aircraft's super lightweight. But the reality is you're only going to be on it for like 7 minutes at a time. So we need to kind of think a little bit differently. It's so different from getting on a 737 to fly across the States, right? What you're doing it much more like an Uber. It's something you jump in, you're in it for a few minutes, you jump out the other end. And kind of to the same point, we don't expect people to book days or weeks or months in advance like you might do today with a commercial jetliner. We're building the software that allows people to go, book it and be on it in minutes. And that's really where the magic comes.
So, Oliver, our interest at Wisdom Tree in what made us land at Joby Aviation as a company was we came via the battery technology route. So we were looking at exciting emerging technologies which are employing battery as a technology and doing cool stuff with it. Now, eVTOLs, as you mentioned, use batteries, and that makes them clean and that makes them quiet. But battery
Mm-hmm.
technology itself is evolving quite quickly. There are different battery chemistries out there. We've heard in recent times Toyota, your own manufacturing partner, make a lot of headlines last year about solid state batteries and how those could be a
Mm.
game changer for electric vehicles. There's also hydrogen. Again, Toyota is doing a lot of stuff there as well. So a lot of different powertrains being talked about in automobiles, and indeed other modes of transportation as well. I'm curious how Joby sees the powertrain potentially evolving for eVTOLs in the future, in terms of battery chemistries, alternative modes of powering the aircraft itself.
Yeah, well, timely topic for us, I think. So I would say lithium ion battery is what we're using right now. It's a battery that comes, it's an automotive supply battery. It's kind of off the shelf. It's one of the few parts of the aircraft that we didn't design. We designed the battery pack, but we don't design the battery cell. So we buy the battery cell, something that exists out there. Now, the cell that we're using requires some pretty impressive performance statistics because you need kind of longevity of charging. You need to be able to fly quite a long way at low power, but you also need to be able to draw really significant amounts of high power at the beginning to lift the aircraft off the ground. And so you need a battery that has very specific characteristics, but we found it. And we've already, if you go look at our YouTube channel, you can see we've flown an aircraft more than 150 miles using the cells that we're using today. So we're kind of confident in the technology that exists today. Of course, as the battery density improves, that's a good thing for us, and we'll be able to kind of go back in and plug in higher density batteries. We kind of have an interesting challenge where in order to certify an aircraft, you kind of have to pause at some point. We're like, okay, this is where we've got to with the technology. Let's certify this. And then the technology continues to improve after that, but you kind of have to stick with the thing that you're certifying. But in the future, once we have a certified aircraft, we expect to be able to go back and introduce the higher density. And what that will give you is either more payload or more range, right? You can sort of work out that balance. But the way we think about it is that electric is really important to urban air mobility. So those journeys that take you 100 miles, maybe more in the future, say 150. But once you start looking at different kinds of journeys, actually you need to start looking at different forms of propulsion. So, I think there's definitely a demand in the future for us to be able to take off. So what we're talking about today is take off vertically in Manhattan and land at JFK. That's really cool. Definitely saves you time versus the ground. But what if we could pick you up at the same heliport, same infrastructure, same Joby, same team, same airframe, pick you up from from Manhattan, from a downtown Manhattan heliport, and take you to Boston? And so now you haven't had to go out to JFK, wait for an aircraft, get on it, fly kerosene powered to Boston, then be in the wrong place and get back into the city center. We could take you city center to city center using vertical technology. And for that, we would expect the answer to be hydrogen. Or hydrogen electric. It's kind of a hybrid system. We acquired a company called H2 Fly, based out of Germany, a couple of years back already, and they've been developing hydrogen fuel cell technology. They've already demonstrated they've flown the longest mission with somebody on board a hydrogen electric aircraft already. They're taking great strides, and we think there's plenty of potential in the future for that to kind of be the next stage, is how we get to kind of regional emissions-free travel. And then if you're feeling really futuristic, when you look beyond regional travel, you get to kind of like continental or intercontinental travel. Well, that's a whole different ball game, but we still think there's routes to achieving that using emissions-free technology. It's a long way out, but it's possible. So the roadmap kind of goes electric, a little bit more electric, hydrogen electric, and then who knows from there.
It was interesting when you were mentioning the competitive landscape a little bit, in the sense that what other two-seaters and four-seaters and five-seaters might be available out there. We know that Joby Aviation is not alone in developing this sort of technology, eVTOLs, and something similar. I'm curious to just explore that topic a bit further in terms of the competitive landscape. Again, I keep drawing the analogy with cars. Because in cars, for example, the product is fundamentally quite homogeneous, but people make their purchase decision based on things like how powerful is the engine, and now maybe they want electric or petrol or diesel or whatever, what have you. Maybe they look at the tech features, the specs, the look and feel. Maybe they know the brands, so they have a certain feel for the brand itself. price, of course, is an important factor. In a world, in the eVTOL world, where there might be a few different manufacturers, I'm
Hmm.
curious what will be the key distinguishing factors when customers are making their decisions?
Yeah, great question. So you're right. It's very different from the auto world, and that's, I guess, at least for the first however many years or decades of our industry, is because the infrastructure and the availability of it and the availability of the vehicle will change and not be like it is. The thing with cars today is everyone can drive any car on the road, and if you want to buy a Ford or you want to buy a Nissan, you can go get one easily, and you can drive on a road that's right outside your house, typically. So those two things won't be the same to start with, right? So the availability of the aircraft will be gated by the ability of the company to certify and then build it, manufacture it, and insert it into cities, which is a sort of complex regulatory process. So in reality, people's decisions in years 1 to X, but I would say kind of guessing kind of at least 1 to 10 is going to be, the Joby aircraft is here in New York City and there aren't any others, so this is my choice. Or maybe there's Joby aircraft that can go 100 miles and company Y that can only go 10 miles. And so, I know which one I want to use because it's got the range to take me where I want to go. But for the short hop, maybe I want to use somebody else's. That's also possible. They could coexist like that. The reality of having two companies successfully certify an aircraft, build it at scale, operate it within a city using infrastructure seems like that's going to be the gating factor for at least the introduction of the service. So availability is definitely one. Infrastructure is another. So there's going to be, if you look at New York City today, there are a few helipads that we could use in and around Manhattan. Then there are a few more out as you kind of extend out from the city. We would love in any city in the world to start building new infrastructure. And so, for example, we plan to launch service in Dubai as early as next year, as early as 2025. And for that, we're looking at working with a company called Skyports to build new infrastructure, and they're looking at building 4 vertiports, as we call them, which would be the nodes that we land and take off from. And so there will be those 4 ports that we can go and land, but that it's not a huge amount, and they don't have a huge amount of capacity. And so, again, availability of infrastructure may be a limiting factor. And in the case of Dubai, we've actually made a exclusive agreement with the RTA, which is the government agency there that regulates air taxis, to be the exclusive provider of air taxis in Dubai. So, in Dubai, the choice will be, well, Joby or not, for 6 years at least. And so I think the reality is not that people will be choosing based on the design, the interior, the brand, the company. They're going to be choosing it on the availability of the technology, who's actually got one, who's managed to get it there, who's certified it, who's built the infrastructure, who's got the funds to develop it and turn up and run it in a city. And we shouldn't underestimate the complexity. There are something like 1,000 companies who have a version of an eVTOL aircraft, and the reality of how many of those will actually get to the end point is anybody's guess, but probably a smaller percentage.
And Oliver, in thinking about it, I mean, I was and you alluded to it because this idea of partnering with a company building a certain number of skyports. I was thinking of sort of the case in the US for what we've seen in terms of electric vehicles, which, like Mobeen was saying, the
Mm.
vehicle, it's still basically 4 wheels, rubber tires, it's on the ground, you're delivering power, you're sitting basically the same way, still a steering wheel. So the vehicle itself is the same, but the one key difference is the world of the US market built up around this idea. You pull up to the gas pump, and that experience takes between 5, 7, 10 minutes, depending. There's plenty of pumps. Your highways are built around there being constant availability of pumps. And besides Elon
Mm.
Musk with the supercharger network, none of the other, like, Ford had their EVs and GM had their EVs and everybody had their EVs, but nobody had their quote unquote charging network. And you hear the horror stories. I'm trying to
Yeah.
get here, trying to get there. The plug isn't working. This isn't working. The charging network was there, but nothing was working. All the rest. And so
Mm.
what is it like? Because it seems like, okay, in Dubai you had a sort of particular plan, but in, say, New York
Mhm.
City, as an outsider, the assumption would be you have certain heliports that exist. So one would assume, at least as a starting point, because there's not just unlimited space in the city. Whereas in other areas, like if you were in Denver, Colorado, or something, maybe there's a lot more space, so you're able to be potentially a bit more flexible. But then, similar to what you're saying, if you want to land somebody center of the city, almost like a train station, like an aerial version of the train station, then that's going to be a whole lot of infrastructure. And I'm assuming either you're partnering up every time, or maybe it's Joby building the vehicle, Joby running the service, Joby building the vertiport as well, doing everything.
Yeah, there's a relative amount to unpack there. I would say from the infrastructure side, we expect the delivery of it to come in various forms. So some of it we might partner to build. Lots of it we would expect to be built either by companies dedicated to developing infrastructure, or by the property owners themselves who appreciate that there's value in having this at their facility, whatever that is. Let's say it's like a stadium or a hotel or something where you want to attract guests and have something novel. Hopefully, people will see value in that. Or housing developments where they have defined the value of the property might be greater if there's a development called Lake Nona out in Florida, where they've for many years now have talked about building something into their new housing development as a way of it kind of being a futuristic town, and that's a great way of them kind of connecting the house values, because they're away from the city, but if they can get you to the city real quickly, that can be great for the house value, right? You can work in, for example, downtown Orlando but live out of it, and that'll be very appealing, and we hope people will help kind of recognize that and develop it, much like people do all sorts of other things with developments today, right, that make them appealing. So that's one point. I guess the next is there space? Well, there are two sides to that argument. First, I would say you don't need as many nodes as you'd think in a city for it to be really useful to be flying around it. If you can, we're partnered with Uber. They're a strategic investor in Joby as well, along with Delta. So imagine you kind of like you've flown on a Delta flight and you get to JFK, and then you want to get downtown, and we get you to the Wall Street helipad. And we land you there, and we can connect you, and we plan to connect you to an Uber car that will kind of carry you your last 3 or 4 minutes of your journey. And so you don't have to be absolutely where you want to go, but you need to be close enough that you're not stuck in traffic on the way, right? But we would like to get you as absolutely close as you can. And the great thing is, we can build on top of things because we land vertically. If you've got a train stations have big roofs, right? And you can provide it's flat, not always flat, but provided it's flat, we can build something on top. And we're looking at airports right now like JFK and LaGuardia and LAX, and what we're looking at things like parking structures. How do you build a small landing pad that sits on the side of a parking structure that happens to be right across from the terminal, or even in some cases on the terminal roof? Imagine you land on the terminal roof and you can get an elevator, you come down and you're already in the Delta check-in area, for example. I mean, those are the kind of connections we're hoping to deliver. Sure, in the early years of service, it's not going to be exactly like that. But people are leaning in. At the end of last year, the end of 2023, we flew our aircraft out of the Wall Street Manhattan heliport. So that's, it's down by Wall Street, sits out over the East River. And we flew the aircraft there. And that was great because it kind of brought the whole thing to life for people. This is a real aircraft in a real environment, in a use case that you can really imagine today. And also, by the way, that place is super busy with helicopters day in, day out. And hearing how quiet it is makes a real big difference too. But the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, was there. And he committed at the time to electrifying the heliport. So, there are cities and places around the world that are already taking the steps to make sure that the infrastructure exists. And the great thing is, because it's regulated, because we absolutely need the infrastructure, it's going to work, right? We're going to be running, either us or the operator of the heliport will be running that infrastructure. And it's going to be, it's relatively different from turning up with your car and plugging it in. It's all relatively well organized, well regulated, and we've actually already designed the charging terminal. So we have something called the GEEK standards, a global electric aviation system that we've designed, that has the charge port and the cables that are required. And it's actually a little bit different from car charging. So car charging is electricity. For our aircraft, we have electricity. We also have data, so data offload from the aircraft to make sure that we're kind of pulling everything that we need to know about the performance of the aircraft, and we have cooling. So we charge super quickly. Today Tesla, there's a cooling mechanism within cars today, but we are talking about liquid cooling. So we're actually a transfer of liquid material between the charging station and the aircraft to keep that battery cool as it charges, because we want to do it really quickly. Our goal is that we can, assuming that most journeys are like 20 miles, 6-7 minutes in the aircraft, we actually plan to be able to charge the aircraft in the time it takes you to get people off and then put people back on and be ready to take off. And so actually you wouldn't even notice that the aircraft's being charged.
Wow, that is. I mean, this is what you picture as a. Mobeen and I are both frequent travelers. We find ourselves in the center of cities, needing. Some airports are way out there, an hour away. Some airports are right there. But this, you're getting us excited, Oliver. So we said at the beginning we did not want to make the entire podcast about trying to predict when the FAA may or may not do
Yeah.
various steps, but at the same time, we just did a podcast on a related sort of topic, in the sense that we were just talking about AI drug discovery. And AI drug discovery is not you snap your fingers and the drug is ready. It's current drug discovery is a 10 or so year process. So I don't know if what we're talking about here is a 10 or so year regulatory process, but it's also not a tomorrow process. And so to give everyone the best relevant understanding of what steps the FAA might make a company like this go through, what can we do to sort of bring clarity to the journey here?
So I would say there are 3 core FAA certificates required. So we have to have, if you're based in the US, but by the way, much of the world relies on the FAA guidance. So, if you've done something with the FAA in the US, you can typically export that relatively easily and go and operate in other countries. The FAA requires 3 things, which is a production certification. So basically, like, can you build aircraft to the standard that you've designed? That's probably, I wouldn't say the easiest. None of them are easy, but that's the easiest to understand of the 3, and something that we will get to. Then you have the Part 135 air operation certification. So, if you want to operate an aircraft, you also have to have the FAA say, these people know how to train pilots, how to run aircraft, how to do it safely. So in order to run a service, you have to have certification from the FAA. We actually already have that Part 135 certification in place, and we've had it for a couple of years. And so it's kind of interesting. What we do right now is, we use an aircraft. It's called a Cirrus SR-22. It has 4 passenger seats and a pilot, and we use that to pretend or simulate that we're running a Joby airline, and we use it to practice all of our software. So we've developed all the software that allows us to work out, like, how do you get an aircraft and a pilot and a landing infrastructure all in the same place, and so safely run it. And so, we kind of have that airline certification in place, and it covers our Cirrus aircraft, conventional aircraft today. And what we will want to do is add our Joby aircraft into that airline, which is a relatively nothing simple, but simpler thing to do. Once it's type certified, and that really is the key to unlocking everything. So, to recap, you can have a production certificate to build it, you have a Part 135 to operate it, but the one really, really core thing you need is a type certificate. And that type certificate is the thing that we've spent by far the most energy and time on, and it's the most important. And that's the one that says, the FAA come and they look at it and they're like, okay, this aircraft is safe for commercial passenger operations. That's a multi-year process. We began years ago, and we still have plenty of time ahead of us to go and finish it. We divide it into 5 stages at Joby, and each quarter in our shareholder letter, we report on the progress against achieving those 5 stages. We've finished stages 1, 2, and 3. We're in progress on stage 4, and we've done a little bit of stage 5. Basically, what it looks at is, like, can you design an aircraft that should work? Do you have test plans in place that we agree with to test it? Then you go and test it. And and those tests are from, you start with a single part. So you're like, okay, this bolt, does this meet specification? And if that passes, you kind of bake, break, and shake it. Like, if that little bolt passes, put that bolt in the flight control computer. And you're like, okay, let's test the flight control computer. And like, okay, shake, bake, break it, do everything you can. Does that pass the test? Yes, it does. Then you put it in the flight control system, test that, and eventually you work your way up to the full aircraft. And so it's only right at the very end of the process that you're kind of like putting an FAA pilot in the aircraft and saying, okay, fly the whole thing. Does the whole thing make sense? But the design of the parts, the certification, one of the things we had to do at the beginning was agree with the FAA what it is that we're certifying. What is this aircraft? What matters? How do you define the safety of it? So we kind of define those things and we wrote the test plans, and we're kind of in the middle of doing a lot of those test plans right now. So we're kind of from the very basic parts up to the top, doing thousands of tests that will eventually get us to the point that we're able to finish the process. And so stages 1, 2, and 3 are done, 4's in progress, 5's in progress. Once we have all 5, the FAA issue a type certificate. That type certificate, then we drop in the airline certificate, the Part 135, and we pair it with our production certificate that says we can build it safely. Now that we know what we're building, we can build it. And with those 3, you have everything you need to go do commercial service. It's a lot.
That's super exciting, and you've clearly got both of us very much impatient to get onto one of these things. And but one thing that's of interest, certainly, let's say in the future, Chris or I, we make a business trip, and we end up calling one of these eVTOLs, and then we send an expense receipt to a finance department, and they end up getting a heart attack. And we get a severe telling of why were you indulging in this luxury. I'm curious. I know that the vision of Joby Aviation is that this is going to be a premium air taxi kind of thing, rather than just reserved for the most wealthiest people who can afford it. But I'm curious to know how the economics will work to make it accessible to more people, and ultimately, I know with technology there are economies of scale, but to start off, what will the economics look like, and maybe how will they evolve over time?
Yeah. So our goal or mission or vision is absolutely to make it as broadly accessible as possible. We do this because we want to decarbonize air travel. We want to take traffic off the ground. We want to get people to where they want to go quicker than they're able to do it today. And it just makes sense. But we want it to be absolutely as accessible as possible. And Joe Ben, who founded the company, has that kind of mission deep in his heart, right? And so we never designed it with the idea that it would be a kind of exclusive VIP only, just for the rich kind of thing. It's designed to be able to achieve a price point that is surprisingly good. I think if you were to take a helicopter ride today and try and expense that, absolutely people should or would have a heart attack. Although, you can get a Blade helicopter today from Manhattan to JFK for only, I think it's less than $200 now, right? Which is not horrific compared to Ubers, which have, or Lyft or whoever your rideshare partner of choice is, they're getting expensive. And so, where we anticipate the service launching is something along the lines of an Uber Black price in terms of per seat per mile. Obviously, when you book an Uber Black, you're paying for the whole car, whereas with Joby, you were talking about one seat. But we expect it to be in that kind of ballpark. It may start a tiny bit more expensive that we don't actually know exactly yet, because there's a lot of dependencies to get through, but the target is to get it way below that price. So we talk typically in kind of dollars per passenger mile. So the price of the ticket relatively based on the distance that you travel, and we would love to get that down to something that's more in like the $2, $3, $4 per passenger mile than the kind of 6 or 7 that it kind of is likely to be at around the Uber Black price. So we don't know exactly yet, but our mission is to get it as low as possible. Demand and supply will be something we have to moderate for at the beginning of the service, but everything allows you theoretically to get that price down, right? And it's things like the utilization of the aircraft. So if you have an electric aircraft that's quiet and it's using electricity rather than aviation fuel, and therefore the fuel is cheaper, the aircraft utilized higher, and if the aircraft is utilized higher, the pilot cost is lower, per passenger per trip. and so is the aircraft. You're able to amortize the cost of the aircraft across many more trips than a helicopter would today, for example. And we hope that by kind of generating that economy of scale, that also allows us to bring the price down.
So Oliver, I have to say it's been a pleasure. Unfortunately, we could spend the rest of the day discussing, but unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time. I was
Me
just
too.
in New York. I just experienced. Now my trick in New York is to take that trip out to LaGuardia from Manhattan at 4:30 in the morning. So it whooshes me over, similar to a Joby aircraft. But many people are saying 4:30 in the morning. You've got to be kidding me. I want to operate more like a human being than a vampire. And so at the end of the day, we see the use case, and we are going to be continuing to watch. I mean, the battery technology and what we were saying about hydrogen is already fascinating. And like Mobeen said, that's what got
Mhm.
Wisdom Tree and Wood Mackenzie's attention with regard to our strategies. But then there are a lot further places we can go from here. So I want to thank everyone for taking time with us, Mobeen and myself today, as well as Oliver Walker Jones, Head of Marketing, Communications, and Brand at Joby Aviation. And for anyone asking that question, the age old question, where is my flying car? We've done our best to try to answer it in the last 60 minutes. And come back to Mobeen and I for the next episode. Like we say all the time, we're always bringing new and exciting guests to the table. Take care.